Good evening and welcome to the first LaRouche Pack webcast of the new year. Tonight is Friday, January 2nd, 2015. My name is Matthew Ogden, and I would like to welcome you and also welcome both Megan Beats and Jeff Steinberg, who are joining me in the studio for tonight's broadcast. Our first question for the evening concerns the coming implosion of the utterly bankrupt transatlantic financial system. This reality is being widely acknowledged now out in the open by leading publications from both Wall Street and the City of London, with The Economist, for example, describing the upcoming elections in Greece as Europe's Lehman moment, which will set off a chain reaction across the entirety of the Eurozone. And the Washington Post echoing this warning, saying that the odds of Greece leaving the euro have never been higher, and announced that this is, quote, endgame for Europe. And we also had another economist write this week that Greece is the Bear Stearns of the European debt crisis, warning that those who miss this reality will be seriously wrong about what is ahead as we go into 2015. Now, at the same time, we face the looming explosion of the derivatives time bomb here on Wall Street, with the 50% collapse in the price of oil and gas now serving as the detonator of this explosion. This was very well documented in a new article which was published by Paul Gallagher of Executive Intelligence Review, which is now available on the LaRouche Pack website under the title Wall Street Puts the Debt in Detonator, in which Paul Gallagher shows that these bubbles are now inflating beyond control, and the credit derivatives exposure of U.S. banks has increased by 27% with foreign exchange, with the credit derivatives in the third quarter of last year, while the foreign exchange derivatives increased by 90% in that same quarter. So it is this massive exposure of these astronomically leveraged bubbles, which is now threatening to set off a unstoppable collapse cycle of default and deleveraging, which is what prompted Jamie Dimon, Barack Obama, and John Boehner to join forces 2 weeks ago and force through an 11th hour repeal of the provision prohibiting federal bailouts of commodity and foreign exchange derivative swaps by attaching it as a rider to the omnibus spending bill. This action now puts the American people on the hook for tens of trillions of dollars in oil and gas and other commodity derivatives that are set to blow. Now, Mr. LaRouche said that what Wall Street did with this was not an act that represents political power, but represents pure desperation on their part. And this is why Wall Street and the City of London are now engaging in an all-out drive for a war confrontation with Russia at this point, which is the trigger for a global thermonuclear war. As Mr. LaRouche stated earlier this week in discussions with the LaRouche Pack Policy Committee, this law, on behalf of Wall Street, was enacted through fraud and is actually a violation of the intention of the United States Constitution. And if we allow this to stand, he said, the majority of the world is at risk of thermonuclear extinction. He said that what Wall Street is doing is setting itself up to organize a world war as a way of having a cover to maintain the authority of Wall Street against the nation. And the only way you can protect the human race under these conditions is to shut down Wall Street by calling its bluff and forcing it through a bankruptcy reorganization in the spirit of our first Treasury Secretary, Alexander Hamilton. So, with that said, I would like to ask Jeff Steinberg to elaborate on this situation a little bit more and to give us an idea of the necessary actions that we must take as we come into this new year.
Thanks, Matt. Look, I think it's important right off the bat to distinguish between the trigger and the bomb. The bomb is the fact that the entire transatlantic financial system is hopelessly and irreversibly bankrupt. There's been all kinds of talk about a bail-in to deal with the imminent debt crisis, the debt explosion, which is merely a step towards yet another enormous bailout. If you consider the magnitude of the transatlantic derivatives bubble, just to take one aggregate figure that tells you just why this debt is unpayable in any form whatsoever, just consider the fact that BIS estimates and other estimates are that the cumulative size of the current outstanding derivatives contracts of the major transatlantic banks is well over $1 quadrillion. That's $1,000 trillion. The most optimistic view of the entire global combined GDP, which includes an enormous amount of fluff, is at best $55 trillion. So in other words, you have an impossible leveraged bubble that cannot and will not ever be paid. So that's the situation. This is the situation that was created by the end of the Bretton Woods system in 1971 that created the climate for speculation to completely trump productive investment in the transatlantic region. It carried forward with the repeal of Glass-Steagall in 1999. In 2007, we had a blowout of parts of that financial bubble. There was a massive bailout, $23.7 trillion, wiped off taxpayers' books to bail out Wall Street, AIG, the big banks. And now we've reached a point where, far from being immune from a new too-big-to-fail crisis, the banks in the United States and the banks in Europe are 40 to 80% bigger than they were, with even more extreme exposure. This was the consequence of having failed to take Lyndon LaRouche's advice back in the 2007-2008 period, when he introduced the Homeowners and Bank Protection Act at the very beginning of the blowout of the mortgage bubble, and at that point called immediately for the reinstating of Glass-Steagall. The failure to do that, the bailout instead, has meant that Wall Street has been even more extravagant and irrational in the bubble that they've built up. So right now we're at a point where the entire system is set to blow. And it's an impossible to pay and illegal and criminal gambling debt that's been accrued by the banks on the back of taxpayers. It never will be paid. And so we're facing a critical moment. And there are many potential detonators out there, but it's important to first start by understanding that the bomb is a megaton bomb of unpayable debt. And that's not something that occurred in the last few weeks or in the last few months. It's been a cumulative process over a long period of time. Wall Street intervened hysterically to make sure that the one small provision of Dodd-Frank that meant a damn thing was repealed just before Congress went into recess. And it caused a political backlash, but they were desperate enough that they were willing to pay that price. You had President Obama and Jamie Dimon working the phones. You had Democratic members of Congress screaming that it was no longer appropriate to accept the blackmail and extortion coming from the White House. It was an act of desperation precisely because one of the potential detonators, triggers for the blowout of this entire bankrupt system is the fact that oil prices have been driven down by 50, 60% over the last several months. You have about the only section of the U.S. economy that, quote unquote, is growing is the shale oil and gas scam, in which hundreds of thousands of people have been drawn in. And now you have shale oil and gas being produced in places like North Dakota and Texas, where the cost of production is substantially higher than the price that they're getting per barrel. Now, the people running this shale oil and gas scam have basically hedged against exactly this kind of price collapse. And so you've got Wall Street banks that are sitting on trillions of dollars of future contracts, derivatives, complex contracts piled on top of them. And we're estimating that the immediate bubble associated with the collapse of these oil prices is in the range of $20 trillion. In other words, something doubling even the fantasy figures about the size of the U.S. economy as a whole. So it's an impossible situation. Under these circumstances, Wall Street and their friends in London are contemplating the exact kind of measures that were taken repeatedly in the 20th century with 2 world wars, that were the policies that were adopted by the financial oligarchy of Europe at the time of the Black Death of the 14th century. The way you resolve a debt bubble that is unpayable is you start a war. And under the fog of war, you can restructure that debt while maintaining political control. So under the circumstances that we're facing today, what's the kind of war that one could anticipate? Well, the United States and NATO, with strong British prodding, are provoking a war with Russia. They're provoking a war with China. And under these circumstances, the prospects of such a war remaining contained below the threshold of thermonuclear war of extinction is rather remote. So we're dealing here with a situation in which it's singularly and exclusively the desperation of Wall Street and London that is driving the world towards war. Now, this is an enormous gamble to be taking on the idea that somehow or other Russia and China are going to blink and will back down and capitulate in the face of this threat of war. That is simply not going to happen. Last week, Russia issued its new strategic military doctrine, and it was once again a reminder that the Russian leadership, President Putin, key advisors, the Russian top military and intelligence command, believed that the actions that have been being taken, centered around the Ukraine situation and other actions, represent nothing short of an attempt at regime change in Moscow. You had the British press just in the last week going into the New Year's openly saying that 2015 would be the year where there is a coup d'etat to overthrow the Putin government in Russia, either by liberal oligarchs or by ultra-nationalists. But either way, Britain, London, is openly talking about the idea that there will be a coup against Putin in this coming year, in the immediate weeks and days potentially ahead. This kind of madness is in fact driving the world towards the danger of a thermonuclear confrontation, because Russia has made clear that they will not surrender their sovereignty. The Russians have poured an enormous amount of investment in modernizing their nuclear triad. And so they have made it clear they're prepared to go to war, but only under the conditions that the Western powers persist in going for confrontation. Ukraine, the deployment of the ABM systems into southern Europe, some of them right on the Black Sea adjacent to Russia. All of these moves, all of these actions, the eastward deployment of NATO, are being viewed as part of a new form of warfare directed at Russia, which includes a very large component of asymmetric warfare, which the Russians and others refer to as the color revolutions. So these two events, in the minds of most people, are seen as separate and unrelated. The emerging likelihood of a new financial blowout on an order of magnitude greater than 2008 in the US and 2010 in Europe, and the danger of war. But that would be a grave mistake. It would be a failure to understand the real lessons of history. The two things are absolutely related, and therefore it's important to realize that the only way to genuinely prevent war, to have an assured avoidance of this kind of war that would very likely be a war of extinction is to wipe out Wall Street. They're hopelessly bankrupt, and therefore they are perfectly ripe to be put out of their collective misery through an orderly bankruptcy reorganization. Now, earlier this year, Lyndon LaRouche put forward what he referred to as the 4 cardinal laws of what must be done to restore the United States to its historic traditions, its constitutional tradition of Hamiltonian sovereign debt national banking. And that begins with the reinstating of Glass-Steagall, which in and of itself will force either a complete write-off of this massive criminal gambling bubble that's been accrued on Wall Street and in London, and the reestablishment of secured commercial banking separate from all of this absolute unpayable gambling debt. If Wall Street refuses to go with an orderly writing off of all of that gambling debt, then they're going to be wiped out anyway. Because once there is no longer a guarantee of a federal bailout of the Wall Street gambling casino, then either it's going to be shut down or there will be the biggest margin call in history, and they'll be wiped out either way. So there's nothing that can be done in the universe of sane war avoidance to save that Wall Street bubble. Once you have reinstated Glass-Steagall and gone back to a commercial banking system, precisely along the lines of what Franklin Roosevelt did in June of 1933 with the Glass-Steagall Act. Once you've done that, then you go back to traditional American constitutional principles. You reestablish national banking in precisely the form that it was first established by Alexander Hamilton when he was the first Treasury Secretary of the United States. And then you put massive amounts of directed credit into the reestablishment of a technology-intensive revival of the U.S. economy. That means, among other things, the United States becoming involved in a serious crash effort to realize thermonuclear fusion, which is the future source of energy for mankind. It means reviving the space program. And above all else, it means that the United States, by taking these urgently needed steps, is perfectly positioned to accept the order that was offered by President Xi Jinping of China for the United States to join the BRICS process. In point of fact, the United States, from a historic standpoint, has every reason to be a fully integrated partner with Russia, China, India, Brazil, South Africa, and the cluster of other countries that are aligning around this alternative new paradigm system. From Egypt to South Korea, Japan will align, Germany will align, and all of this is ready to happen. Now, we're talking about a fundamental change in the way that the U.S. government functions. And we've had a total collapse of the functioning of the executive branch for the last 14 years under Bush Cheney and now under Obama. This change is going to require a direct mobilization of the American people. And Mr. LaRouche, in recent months, has been emphasizing the importance of what he calls our Manhattan Project. We have a leading strata of people, a leading grouping of American citizens in the immediate Manhattan, New York City, northern mid-Atlantic states area. And they are representative of among the best elements among our population. We've seen Congress capitulate time and again. We saw Congress capitulate just several weeks ago to the Wall Street demand that the only remaining element, really the only element, period, within the Dodd-Frank bill that carried any teeth. It was the Blanche Lincoln Amendment that said that the government will not, taxpayers will not bail out certain categories of derivatives. Precisely the derivatives contracts tied to this collapsing shale oil and gas sector. So basically, Congress, left to its own devices, will cave in, will capitulate time and time again to Wall Street's blackmail and extortion. The only alternative is an uprising of the American people who understand the key issues that are on the table, that Wall Street is an existential issue now for the country. It is the issue of war or peace, and perhaps even the very survival of mankind. So it's going to take an informed and educated outpouring. Manhattan is exemplary of the best informed citizenry that we've got. But left to their own devices, Congress is not going to do it. With the pitchfork of an informed and mobilized American electorate putting pressure, it's a different story altogether, at a point that Wall Street, in fact, is at its weakest moment. They're on the verge of a bankruptcy worse and bigger than what we saw in 2008. And under no circumstances can we allow for a replay through bailout and bail-in of this bubble that in some cases is 40 to 80% bigger than it was at the time of the Lehman Brothers triggering of the collapse of 2008. So this is in effect very much a clarion call to all of you out there. Under our constitutional system, it is actually illegal to be stupid, to be politically uninformed. So we've got to make sure that the mobilization is there to secure a victory at a point when the enemies of this nation, Wall Street and London, are in a situation of desperation and where they can be brought down. And that is the issue of survival for this country. So I think that that's the moment we're at. The Wall Street issue and the war issue are one and the same thing. They're not distinct. They can't be compartmentalized and separated. And so that's on the table at the start of this new year for all of us.
So this will be our institutional question for the evening. It reads as follows. Mr. LaRouche, on December 21st, 2014, the New York Times editorial board called for a full criminal investigation into those behind the Bush-era torture program, starting with former Vice President Dick Cheney, his general counsel David Addington, and others in the policy chain of command, including at the Justice Department's Office of Legal Policy. The same editorial sharply criticized President Obama for presiding over the cover-up of the Bush-Cheney-era torture. What is your view, and what are the steps that you believe must be taken? Now, I'll just note quickly, before I invite Jeff up to the podium to answer, that earlier this week, Lyndon LaRouche demanded the appointment of an independent counsel with full authority to investigate and prosecute both the current and former top government officials who ordered these crimes against humanity, and of the others who actively covered them up. Obviously, this includes emphatically Dick Cheney and Barack Obama. Mr. LaRouche said, "We cannot allow these extreme constitutional violations and violations of international law to go unpunished, if we are to survive as a nation. As one of the surviving 16 million Americans who served in World War II and fought to defeat a Hitler-Nazi regime that committed unspeakable crimes against humanity, I can speak with special authority. Bringing these criminals to justice is the ultimate test of whether our nation has the moral fitness to survive. To tolerate and cover up such heinous actions conducted on such a large scale by elements of our own government is itself a crime against our nation's principles enshrined in the Constitution." So, Jeff.
Well, I think that Mr. LaRouche's statement from earlier the week really makes the point very clearly. This is a watershed moment. And of course, there's an added dimension to this entire situation because now we see the specter of a potential Jeb Bush campaign for the Republican nomination for president, which means that the entire Bush-Cheney apparatus that basically committed crimes that the world has not seen since Hitler are once again asserting their right to take control back over this country. And so, therefore, there's an added sense of urgency beyond the fact that this country cannot and will not survive morally if we allow these crimes, which are now out there and well documented, to go unpunished. And you've got the crimes that were committed by those in the government structure, both within the CIA and also there was a parallel and integrated program within the military. People should recall Abu Ghraib, where the same kinds of torture methods were being used. These were matters that were policy issues that were set at the very top of the Bush administration. President Bush, Vice President Cheney, Vice President Cheney's general counsel, David Addington, Alberto Gonzales, who was the White House general counsel to President Bush, later the Attorney General of the United States. All of these people signed off on this program. There would not have been a CIA torture program. There would not have been an Abu Ghraib torture prison if it were not for the fact that high-level officials of the former government said explicitly and in writing that it was permissible to carry out these crimes against humanity. People may remember that one of the memos that circulated around the White House that said that the Geneva Conventions against torture were, quote, quaint and outdated. So these are heinous crimes. And now with the 524-page executive summary of the Senate Intelligence investigation, we have a window into the details of what went on. The report itself focused on 20 case studies, 20 individuals, and went through in detail the kinds of torture that they were subjected to. And so this is a top-down policy that can only be dealt with by putting the people responsible for those policies in jail, by legitimate investigation, by criminal prosecution. Secondly, and this was another point that was even picked up in the New York Times editorial, President Obama basically did everything he could for 7 years to cover up those heinous crimes. And in fact, he did everything possible to delay the release of the Senate Intelligence report, the summary of which was provided to him months and months and months ago. When she spoke before the U.S. Senate on the day that the unclassified executive summary was released, Senator Dianne Feinstein was very eloquent. She said, I had to do some soul searching to decide whether or not this was the right thing to do. We have ISIS threatening, beheading, in some cases, American citizens. We have threats against the United States. She said, I had to ask whether it was appropriate under these circumstances to let this information out. But despite that, I realized we had to. What's unique about this country is that we can make these kinds of horrific mistakes, but we present the truth. We put it out before the public, and we punish the criminals. There's no way to go on without doing this. President Obama did everything that he could to cover up those crimes, whether it was because of his close relationship with John Brennan, who may be one of the people prosecuted for the torture programs when he was at the CIA back during the Bush-Cheney period. Whatever the reasons, President Obama is guilty of collusion after the fact, conspiracy after the fact, to cover up these crimes. And so his hands are not clean either. We need to have a thorough investigation. We need to get to the bottom of this. And it's also a very appropriate and timely reminder about what the nature is of this Bush-Cheney machine. People may not remember, but before there was a George Herbert Walker Bush and a son, George W. Bush, and a Jeb Bush, there was Prescott Bush, who was prosecuted and found to have been guilty of trading with the enemy because he, along with Averell Harriman, were involved in bailing out the Nazi Party in the early 1930s at a point that the party was about to collapse and Hitler was contemplating suicide. So you have this long-standing legacy, and therefore it's not at all surprising that we see the magnitude of torture that was carried out by a Bush administration. Now, Cheney was clearly the man in charge and the leading promoter of this policy, but ultimately, throughout that whole period, George W. Bush was president. And so it's the legacy of Bush as well as Cheney that this kind of horror show could have been allowed to take place. And it's now part of the legacy of President Obama, that he's been deeply complicit, personally complicit, in the effort to cover up these crimes by claiming it's better for everyone concerned to go forward and forget the crimes that were committed in the past. That would be like saying because a serial killer hasn't committed a murder in a few weeks, that the 40 people he killed he should go unpunished for that crime of the past. We cannot as a nation morally tolerate that. And I think that Mr. LaRouche, being one of the relatively small number of people who directly put his life on the line in the China-Burma-India theater during World War II, fighting against regimes that carried out these kinds of policies, that it's more than appropriate for him to pull moral rank and say, we've got to move on this immediately. This should be one of the first issues taken up immediately in the next few days when Congress is back and when the question is on the table about what are we going to do. There needs to be an independent counsel because this administration is unprepared to take the necessary steps. And again, it falls very largely on the shoulders of the American people to make sure that we don't miss this critical opportunity to at least reestablish some of our moral perspective on the world by making sure that these crimes are punished and don't go unpunished for another day.
Now, the release of the Senate torture report also opens the floodgates to the full truth concerning another cover-up perpetrated by the Bush administration and perpetuated by the Obama administration for coming out, which is the redacted 28 pages of the Congressional Joint Inquiry Report into the activities of the U.S. intelligence community both before and after 9/11. These 28 pages, which were classified by the Bush administration and continue to be classified by Obama, purportedly document the foreign financing and the domestic support apparatus for the 9/11 hijackers, primarily from high-level officials within the government of Saudi Arabia, including the ambassador at that time, Prince Bandar bin Sultan. Now, there's been a substantial increase of attention on this issue over the past week, with widespread coverage of the denial of a sitting member of Congress's request to view these classified pages, which is perfectly within his rights as a member of Congress, Representative Alan Grayson from Florida, by the House Intelligence Committee. This story broke out into the press this week with an article by Dan Christensen of the Broward Bulldog out of Florida, which was picked up by The Hill and other major press domestically, as well as RT internationally. Now, the release of these 28 pages is going to be the subject of a major press conference that will be occurring this coming Wednesday on Capitol Hill, which will feature former Senator Bob Graham from Florida, who was the co-chair of the original 9/11 Joint Inquiry Report, as well as members of the 9/11 families and members of Congress, Walter Jones, Stephen Lynch, and Thomas Massie, who were the co-sponsors of HRES 428 in the 113th Congress, and will be announcing the reintroduction of this into the new session. Now, the presence of Senator Graham at this event this coming week will obviously be very significant. During an interview with CNN on the day that Feinstein released her torture report, Senator Graham said, "I hope that this is just the beginning of many other pieces of information that the American people have a right to know about." He said the release of the long-censured chapter of the 9/11 report, which dealt with who financed 9/11, is a major issue now. I think the American people have the right to know who our friends are and who our enemies are. Adding that these 28 pages represent, while a major part, nowhere near all of the information which he said has been, quote, systematically withheld from the American people. So, Jeff, could you give us an idea of what the implications of the release of the 28 pages at this time would be in light of both the role of Saudi Arabia in the current economic warfare being waged by the British and Wall Street against Russia, which we discussed earlier in the broadcast, as well as you mentioned, the recent announcement by Jeb Bush of his intention to campaign for the U.S. presidency?
We know from a number of members of Congress who've spoken publicly, Congressman Walter Jones, Congressman Stephen Lynch, Congressman Thomas Massey, and of course, as you said, former Senator Bob Graham, that the content of these 28 pages is absolutely vital for the American people and for the world to fully have access to read and understand. The members of Congress who were allowed to read the 28 pages did so under very restricted circumstances, and therefore none of them have said anything whatsoever about the content. They've commented on their observations about it, and in each instance, what they've said is that, number one, there's nothing in these pages that represents any threat to national security. There's no legitimately classified material. However, it is extraordinarily embarrassing to certain people, including the Bush family and the Saudis, and it forces a complete rethinking of everything that people have tended to think about the political developments of the last 20 or so years, particularly since the time of the original 9/11 attacks. Again, this is an issue that has nothing to do with partisan politics. The cover-up by the Bush-Cheney apparatus of these 28 pages is one thing. That cover-up was adopted and continued by President Obama, even after, on at least 2 separate occasions, he had actually promised representatives of the 9/11 families, people who lost loved ones in the 9/11 attacks, people who themselves were injured and were part of the buildings, either the Pentagon or the Trade Center towers, that were struck on 9/11. He told them point blank that he would declassify the 28 pages. That was in 2009 and again in 2011. And here we are in January of 2015, and he's done nothing, and in fact ordered the Solicitor General of the United States to go into court to argue for Saudi Arabia's sovereign immunity against any revelation of any involvement by the Saudis. So this is very big. It gets to the heart of the enemy within and the enemy among our so-called leading allies. If you want to defeat the Islamic State, if you want to defeat international terrorism, if you want to truly assure that there will be no new 9/11s or similar kinds of attacks anywhere else and around the world, then you've got to take this problem on from the top down. You've got to reveal the role of the Saudis, the British, the Al-Yamama apparatus, the Bush family, everyone involved in the support and carrying out of those terrorist attacks and the cover-up after the fact. This is one of the critical issues, like the issue of bringing justice on the issue of torture, like the issue of bringing Wall Street to its knees because the future survival of the United States is at stake. All of these things are not separate compartmentalized issues. These are existential questions that will determine in the immediate weeks and months ahead whether or not the United States has the moral fitness to survive as a nation. So all of these things represent a critical agenda for bringing the United States back from a point of profound collapse. Probably everyone listening to this broadcast is familiar with the famous exchange between Benjamin Franklin and a Philadelphia woman during the period of the Constitutional Convention. The woman asked Franklin, "What have you given us?" And his answer was, "A republic if you can keep it." If you look at the events of the last 14 years, we've lost that republic. We've virtually ripped up our Constitution. We've given Wall Street the keys to the government. We've committed torture. We've covered up the most heinous crime that's been committed on American soil in memory. And all of those things amount to the fact that our republic has been allowed to be dismantled and destroyed. It's not too late to restore it, but it's an even more profound challenge to actually win back the country. And again, that's not going to happen inside the beltway that surrounds Washington. It's going to happen on the basis of a much broader awakening of you out there to make sure on each of these issues that the right thing is done.
Thank you very much, Jeff. Now, as we enter the new year, I think it's very important to reflect on how much the world has changed since the beginning of 2014 and the role that the LaRouche movement has played in catalyzing those changes. The most significant development, of course, has been the official announcement and the consolidation of the new international economic order being created by the nations of the BRICS. Since the summit in July in Fortaleza, Brazil, the pace of world events has only continued to accelerate, and we've now reached the point at which the BRICS are truly the dominant dynamic shaping global policy. Mr. LaRouche stated earlier this week that the greatest margin of political power in the world now lies in the hands of the BRICS and its associates, and this while all of its opponents are bankrupt. And Mr. LaRouche stated that this is the situation, which is exactly what he had foreseen. Now, it's been made very clear by the leadership of Russia, China, India, the other nations of the BRICS, that the further development and growth of this dynamic is their leading policy priority for the year 2015. The Russian Foreign Ministry released an end-of-the-year statement on December 27th, which stated this explicitly. It said, "The year 2014 was marked by a buildup of instability and an increase in outbreaks of crises in international relations, which are currently transitioning to a new multipolar world order. There was a clear contradiction," it said, "between the need to pursue actions based on genuinely collective partnerships on the international arena in order to develop joint responses to common development or common global challenges and threats, and on the other side, the desire of a number of states to dominate, their attempts to push through their own interests without taking into account the interests of other participants in international cooperation. Therefore," this is the Russian Foreign Ministry, "Russia is focused on the transformation of the BRICS into, quote, a vital element of global governance, with the decisions to establish new multilateral financial institutions, such as the New Development Bank, being of fundamental importance." President Putin, in his New Year's address, broadcast on New Year's Eve, reflected this same firm sense of dedication and determination in achieving this mission. He said, "In the coming year, we will have to jointly address quite a few tasks. The shape of the new year is in our hands. It will depend on how effectively, creatively, and productively each of us will be doing one's job. There are just no other recipes. We must accomplish and implement every single plan of ours, for our own sake, for the sake of our children, and for the sake of Russia." And Chinese President Xi Jinping, in a very beautiful New Year's Eve statement, reflected a similar sense of determination and dedication to the future of both his own country and to the world. Xi Jinping said the following: "We are engaged in an extraordinary and lofty mission. Only perseverance will lead to victory. If we give up halfway, we will get nowhere. Our blueprint is ambitious, but our struggle will certainly be arduous. All people of the country must be united as one. We must pool our wisdom to maximize our opportunity and work together to embrace challenges with united strength, conquer problems with resolute action, and innovation with enthusiasm, so that we can develop our country year by year and constantly improve people's lives." He said the Chinese people are not only concerned with the future of their own country, but also that of the whole world. "We helped the African people fight against the epidemic of Ebola and assisted people in the Maldivian capital suffering from severe water shortages. Many of those moves showed that Chinese people share weal and woe with people in the world. The world is still not stable enough. We long for peace and sincerely wish that global efforts will help relieve all people from hunger, all families from war, and ensure that all children grow in peace and in sunshine." Now, to conclude tonight's webcast, in that same spirit of the mission orientation and the optimism of both Presidents Putin and Xi Jinping, I would like to play a year-end message by Mr. LaRouche, which he recorded for a conference of the Dubna International University, which occurred 2 weeks ago in Moscow. And I think that Mr. LaRouche's message is a very appropriate one, both in terms of where we now stand and a very optimistic statement of what mankind's mission is going into this new year.
Well, my greetings to the conference. What we face now on a planetary scale is something completely new, something that has never happened before, we hope. Because what has happened now, we are on the brink of bringing together the major nations of the planet, the chief nations of the planet in terms of quantity and so forth. They remain in development, but the development is remarkable. For example, in South America, in elements of Africa, in some in elements of Europe, especially in Russia and in some other locations, isolated locations. But the problem is this. We have the British Empire, which is the long-standing enemy of humanity. We have to not only defeat this enemy, we also have to be able to rise to the occasion of bringing the United States, the people of the United States, out of their present misery and disorientation, which is possible, is feasible, it can be done. But the government of the United States, the current government of the United States, is an impossible instrument, and we've got to get rid of most of the elements which are dominating the United States government right now. We also have to emphasize that really what the government of the United States is a branch of the Saudi and British empires, like the empires that are involved in the terror in Asia. So therefore, what we have to think about is the plans that we're going to make or should be making now, which enable the world to take a fresh view of itself. The great nations which have emerged in Asia, in South America, for example, they are great nations and have great potential. But we have to protect the process. We have to eliminate the British Empire. If the British Empire is in power, there is no security. If elements of the United States, which are part of the British Empire, are there, and similar kinds of evil forces, we are in danger of losing everything. The possibility of a thermonuclear war globally is still present. Now, what I'm doing, to make it short, is I'm trying to bring about a dumping of the present United States government, because it's a rotten government and needs to be reformed. You don't need to change the design of the U.S. government. You need to change the composition of the U.S. government, especially in the most recent two major administrations. If that occurs, then I'm sure that the horrors faced by most of the people of the United States and by other nations, those horrors can be defeated. The problem is we have to defeat the enemy which is the force we have to deal with. I'm confident we can do it. I'm confident because I know that there are capabilities in the human mind now which are poorly understood, but the capabilities which people of some parts of the world, and as in China, in some degree, special degree, Russia, India, and so forth, and the BRIC nations, that these nations are moving in the direction of self-development, of joint self-development, which can lead to a new conception of the meaning of the human species and of our planet itself. Things lie before us and far in this system. Things lie before us which have never been dreamed by most people on this planet. But if we are fortunate, we are actually a few steps in scientific progress toward the greatest leap that mankind has ever defined. For example, we know that mankind is not an animal, and no animal is mankind. We know other things about life and things of so forth, which are essential to be known. We see what's happening in China, in the development of the space exploration there. This is a revolution which takes us in the direction of the stars. And other nations will take the same course and follow the same course that is being done in China in this way. And that's what we have to hope for. It's not just hope. It's an understanding of what the great opportunities are and the great dangers are which we lie before us. For example, we right now this woman who is leading and controlling part of Central Europe from the United States, an evil person. This person must be removed from the United States and by the United States. And things like that must occur. But my point is, I see a clear point of optimism, a clear opportunity of greatness. What we have to do is just simply build on that, understand the actions we have to take, understand the preparations we have to make. We are on the verge of the potential of the greatest advantage and progress of mankind which has ever been known. And we have to fight now to make sure we secure that advantage for the sake of the future of mankind as mankind goes out into the higher parts of the solar system.
With those words, I think we are well prepared to embark on a new year and to dedicate our efforts to achieving the great mission that lies before us to ensure that 2015 is the year that Alexander Hamilton's United States comes fully into its own and joins the new international economic order, which Lyndon and Helga LaRouche have invested 40 years of tireless effort and passion into creating. I'd like to announce that there will be a major international event occurring based out of New York City on January 17th. This will be a simultaneously broadcast event into other cities across the United States, And we'd like to ask you to lend your efforts to helping to build for this event and to spread the word in order to bring the United States together around the focal point of LaRouche PAC's critical intervention in New York City. So with that, I would like to bring tonight's webcast to a conclusion. Happy New Year. Thank you very much, and stay tuned.